This lecture is on chapters 55 and 56 from your Campbell textbook, and it's on ecosystems and disruptions, restoration, and conservation of ecosystems. So let's start with our definition of an ecosystem. So when we started our study of ecology, we looked at individual organisms. And then when we have a group of organisms living together in the same area, all of the same species, we have population. And then when we add together different populations living in the same area and their interactions with each other, we have the community level of an ecosystem. And then now we're looking at the actual ecosystem, which is the community, all of the living organisms and their interactions with the non-living portions of a particular area. So it's all of the biotic plus abiotic factors within a specified area. And we know that ecosystems can range from a microcosm, such as a space under a log, or a large area like a lake or even an island. So regardless of an ecosystem's size, its dynamics involve two main processes. We have the flow of energy and the cycling of chemicals. So as you will recall, energy flows through our living world, while chemicals are a contained commodity that have to be cycled. So there's a certain amount of chemicals within our biosphere, and those chemicals go through either a very quick or even a very long-term, thousands of years, cycling within the biosphere. The College Board is focused on four essential questions as we look at ecosystems. The first is, what limits the production level of ecosystems? And by that we mean the producers. So that first level of energy production is going to determine how much life can exist within an ecosystem. So we need to study what are the limits to that and what factors are going to be limiting. We also are going to look at, part of those limits will involve the nutrients that are available within the ecosystem. So how are those nutrients moving within that ecosystem? And then also, how much energy is there within the ecosystem, and how is that energy moving through the ecosystem? And then finally, that piece about disruptions, conservation, etc. We're going to look at human and natural events that cause disruptions to ecosystems. So essentially, we have to go back to that idea of the first law of thermodynamics. So the first law of thermodynamics states that energy can't be created or destroyed. It's only transferred or transformed. So energy is going to enter our ecosystem as solar radiation, and it's a constant input of energy. So as it moves from organism to organism, it is actually losing some of that energy through the release of heat. And so again, this process, if we look at the Earth here as our biosphere, we have the flow of energy that's going to pass through the biosphere and then exit it. And that exit again is through the process of losing heat. In contrast, or on the other hand, we have the cycling of nutrients. So we know that we don't have new nutrients entering the biosphere, or we don't have them really leaving the biosphere, but we do have them cycling around the globe. And nutrients only have that option of cycling. And by nutrients, we mean things like carbon or nitrogen, phosphorus, oxygen, all of those essential elements that are needed for life. So looking again at the flow of energy through an ecosystem, we have our idea of that pyramid. And so we start with the producers, the plants, who are able to take energy from the sun and convert it from light energy into chemical energy. And then that energy is passed on through the different levels within the ecosystem, from, for example, producers to primary consumers to secondary consumers. And we know that at every step of the way, there's loss of energy through heat. So the second law of thermodynamics is what's at play here. It states that every exchange of energy increases the entropy of the universe. And if you remember, entropy is that idea of order. So we increase the entropy, that's actually more disorder is being created. So entropy is this increase of disorder that is occurring. So we looked very early on about the function of enzymes and how when we are actually in a catabolic reaction, we're going from one level of order to a more disordered level. And what we see is a decrease of free energy from that ordered level. So when we're breaking down, for example, glucose into its individual elemental parts of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, we have, through cellular respiration, this gradual release of energy that is occurring. And the mitochondria, of course, are very good at capturing that energy and storing it in the form of ATP. But even within that process, there is an increase in entropy because we are going from a more ordered glucose molecule to a more disordered number of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. And so that increased disorder is also in the process releasing heat. So every time we have this movement from producers to primary consumers to secondary consumers, that energy transfer, we are losing energy as heat. So what is that cost of living? So where is that loss of energy going? So we've already talked about, of course, heat. So you can see here this basic breakdown of why we have this decreasing energy available at the different trophic levels. And we know that what that's due to, again, is cellular respiration and just the normal bodily functions of that living organism, even starting with a plant. So a plant has cellular respiration going on, so it's going to be losing energy that way and not able to store as much. And so this is a real general breakdown here, but you can see that actually a large portion of that energy loss through consumption is actually through waste, for example, through feces. So 50% is estimated actually to be lost in that way. So that digestion process really is not that efficient because there is a lot of energy still remaining in the waste products. There's also, of course, the energy that's lost through cellular respiration. And then we have about 17% of the consumed energy being used for growth. And of that, we estimate about 10% is stored as biomass. And that biomass is what is available to the next consumer. So that's where we get our idea of about 10% of energy being available from one trophic level to the next. So trophic efficiency is this concept that we're describing here. It's the percentage of production transferred from one trophic level to the next. And again, it's usually about 10%. It's that 10% rule. But it really is a range. As in most things in biology, we actually have a range depending on the food chain and the environment that it's taking place in. And so the range is 5 to 20%. And we look at trophic efficiency as a measurement of what's occurring over the length of a food chain. So, for example, if we have 100% of chemical energy being fixed by photosynthesis at the producer level, by the time we get up to the tertiary consumer level, we only have about 0.1% of chemical energy available that was originally in those producers. So we use that idea of a pyramid to represent that loss of energy with each transfer. We also can look at a biomass pyramid, which actually is a little bit different. So it's not really showing us that loss of energy or even the transfer of energy. What it's representing is the dry mass of all organisms within one trophic level. But we do see the same shape. We see that pyramid shape both in biomass pyramids as well as energy pyramids. So we see that same shape in energy pyramids and biomass pyramids, is what that sentence was supposed to end with. So you see here an example of an energy pyramid where we're looking at the different trophic levels. And the reason that they have a similar shape is that we do see a loss of energy at each level. So you can see, first of all, starting with 1,000,000 joules, joule is a measurement of energy, so 1,000,000 joules of sunlight there at the bottom actually ends up with the producer level only able to provide about 10,000 joules for the primary consumers or the herbivores. And the reason behind that is that it's not your 10%, as you can see. It's a much smaller percentage that we actually see being able to be passed up from this primary production to the primary consumption level. And the reason for that is most solar energy is occurring at wavelengths that are not suitable for photosynthesis. We know that those photosystems within the chloroplasts are only able to absorb certain wavelengths of light. So even though there may be 1,000,000 joules of sunlight, not all of it is usable. So we know that almost 98% of solar energy reaching the earth is going to get reflected off of leaves, other surfaces, absorbed by other molecules. Only a small percentage is going to be captured by the plants. And so those plants will then use that energy to undergo photosynthesis. But even that's going to vary by region, because photosynthesis is going to vary depending on the temperature of the environment or the availability of water or other nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. So all of those play into the fact that we have a much smaller percentage of energy transfer from the sun to plants. And then the plants also are having their life processes occurring. So they're undergoing cellular respiration. So they're using some of that energy that they've converted from sunlight for their own life purposes, their growth and their functioning. So what you see here at that green producer level is 10,000 joules. Now we start to see that rule of 10%. So as you move up to the primary consumers who are eating the plants, we only end up with 1% of that energy now being stored in the primary consumers. And that is the amount that now will be available to the secondary consumers. So the secondary consumers are going to then take advantage of that. But by the time they're done with their life processes, they've only got about 100 joules left available for the next top level of tertiary consumers. So we can see now we only have 10 joules available at that top level, according to this example. So the reason we see this pyramid shape with biomass is because with only 10 joules of energy at that top level, there just isn't enough energy to support a large number of organisms. So now let's look at the cycling of nutrients. So this involves the law of the conservation of mass. So that law states that matter cannot be created or destroyed. So chemical elements are continually being recycled in ecosystems because we're not making new ones and we're not destroying the old ones. So if a nutrient's outputs from an ecosystem exceed its inputs, that nutrient is going to limit production. So you can see here in this yellow box, nutrients are entering a food chain and made available to producers. And then the producers are able to then pass it on to whoever consumes them. And then we also have the role here of detritivores. So decomposition is going to connect all of the different levels within an ecosystem, all the trophic levels, because they're going to be the ones that are able to take the nutrients and put them back into the food chain. So they're able to break down whatever chemicals that we are looking at in terms of the cycling. So the energy, the definition, first of all, of a detritivore is a heterotroph that gets its energy from consuming detritus, which is non-living organic matter. So in other words, dead and decaying organisms, producers and consumers, are what make up the food source and energy source for detritivores. So detritivores are then, again, able to put the nutrients back into the food chain. They're also putting it back into the abiotic reservoir. And then that abiotic reservoir is then going to contribute to the geologic processes that are occurring in some of the cycles. And the abiotic reservoir is also entering the food chain as the producers take up nutrients from their environment. Few other facts about detritivores is the rate of decomposition is variable. It is controlled by moisture, temperature, and nutrient availability. So for example, decomposition is slow in a cold or a wet or an anaerobic environment. So these are going to slow down that cycle. So these cycles, we group them under the name biogeochemical cycles. And they're nutrient cycles that contain biotic and abiotic components. So, for example, carbon, oxygen, sulfur, nitrogen are part of these biogeochemical cycles. We also have much slower moving elements like phosphorus, potassium, and calcium. So these tend to spend a lot more time in the abiotic portion of the cycle, which keeps them there longer. So they're considered less mobile. They're just slower moving. And these cycles occur both within just a single ecosystem, but they also occur globally. So terrestrial systems in particular can cycle things just locally, but we also know that, for example, carbon can move around, or oxygen moves around the globe. And also in aquatic systems, there can be a lot more spread and much more a wide geographic range that the cycle occurs in when it's in water. So quickly, I'm just going to go over some of the different cycles. So the key things to think about when you're looking at a biogeochemical cycle is, what is the abiotic reservoir? So for example, for carbon, that's the atmosphere. And then the biotic is the food chain. So photosynthesis is fixing carbon through the Calvin cycle. And so we get this abiotic to biotic transition when we're talking about carbon cycling. It returns to the abiotic reservoir through cellular respiration, and also through the combustion of any living material that contains carbon. So, for example, the burning of firewood releases carbon to the abiotic atmosphere, and to the earth, to the actual soil when we're talking about burning, or the combustion of fossil fuels, which of course we are very familiar with. So oil, gas, and coal. So you can see some of the other reservoirs. We see living things like plants and animals. We have living things aquatically, plants and algae and fish. We have the soil, which can contain carbonates. Deposition of dead material, for example, within the soil is going to be carbon, of course, that is just sitting there within this reservoir. We have carbon dioxide can dissolve in water. And again, the atmosphere is a very large reservoir. For the nitrogen cycle, we have living organisms again are going to be a large reservoir of nitrogen. We also have a very large reservoir of nitrogen in the atmosphere. And then the third large reservoir is the soil or ground. So the abiotic reservoir for nitrogen, the major one is the atmosphere. The biotic one is, again, living organisms. It actually cycles back to the abiotic atmosphere through the action of different bacteria. We call them denitrifying bacteria. We also have decomposing and nitrifying bacteria. So we know that, again, as organisms die, or they have waste products like feces, there's nitrogen contained within there because, of course, we know nitrogen's a major portion of your DNA. So all living organisms have DNA. They all have nitrogen there. We also find nitrogen in amino acids. So all living organisms, again, are a big source of nitrogen. So when we have excretion, feces, or a decaying organism, we have a return of nitrogen into an abiotic reservoir. And then biotic bacteria are going to play a role in making that nitrogen more available to be passed on to the next portion of the cycle. The phosphorus cycle is an example of one of those slow cycles. So the abiotic reservoir for phosphorus is rocks, minerals, and soil. And it enters the food chain through erosion. So that's what makes it so slow. So erosion is the wearing down of these rocks and minerals or soil through natural things like water or through wind. We will also have phosphorus enter the food cycle through the uptake by plants of phosphorus, because that is something that plants need. And decomposing bacteria and fungi are going to be responsible for recycling phosphorus. We have here the water cycle, and I think this is our last one. So in this one, we have, let's go ahead and put the reservoirs here. We have the abiotic reservoir, the major ones being surface water. So, for example, the oceans contain about 97% of the biosphere's water. And then the atmosphere also contains a fair amount of water. And then 2% of water is found in glaciers and polar ice caps. And that leaves about 1% left in the lakes, rivers, and groundwater. So the next concept we want to talk about is limiting factors to primary production. So looking at the flow of energy through an ecosystem, again, we're starting at that producer level. And also when we're talking about the cycling of nutrients through an ecosystem, in terms of the biotic portion of that cycle, we're going to usually start with the primary production level. So we want to look at how do we measure those limiting factors and what are they? So in most ecosystems, the primary production is defined as the amount of light energy that has been converted to chemical energy by the photoautotrophs during a given time period. And then we also have other types of autotrophs. We have chemoautotrophs, who are the primary producers. And so primary production for them, again, would be the amount of energy that they're able to actually capture and convert into chemical energy. So total primary production in the ecosystem is known as the gross primary production, or GPP. And it's measured, again, as the conversion of energy from light or chemicals to the chemical energy of organic molecules over a unit of time. And then we also have this definition of net primary productivity or production, or NPP. And that's simply equal to the gross primary production minus the energy used by the autotrophs for respiration. So whether they're chemoautotrophs or photoautotrophs, they all are living organisms that are going through respiration. So we represent that by that R subscript A there. Generally, what we find is that net primary production ends up being about 1/2 of the gross primary production. And the units of measure for net primary production are joules per meter squared per year, for example, as opposed to biomass, which we could also use as GPP and NPP. So biomass, if we were to use that as our measure, would be grams of dry mass per meter squared per year. So basically what ends up happening, this net primary production, is actually the amount of new biomass that is available and added to a particular area over a specific time period. It's not the total biomass of all of those autotrophs. It's actually the amount that has been added over that time period. And NPP is the only thing that is available to the next level in the trophic pyramid there. So, for example, if we're talking about photoautotrophs, the herbivores, the primary consumers, are only able to consume the NPP, not the GPP. So this picture here shows you satellite data showing ecosystems and their NPP and their contribution of these different ecosystems to the total net primary production of the Earth. So you can see this scale here. This is net primary production in kilograms of carbon, meter squared per year. So now you can see this is kilograms. So we know that this net PP is being measured by biomass, not by joules. And so you can see the low levels are the purple. So it looks like all of the aquatic ecosystems are pretty low, and that would make sense because they're very spread out. And then the hot spots are the red. And what do you notice about where that red or even the yellow is located in terms of sunlight availability? Hopefully you're noticing that it's across the equator where there is the most sunlight and where we find very dense forests, rainforests, for example, are located across this equatorial region. So we have a large number of producers often found within this latitude there. Okay, so we've already talked about the formula there. So NEP is now net ecosystem production. So instead of just looking at net primary production, now we're going to actually look at it as net ecosystem production. And that's going to be measured by the total biomass accumulated during a given time period. And it's going to be equal to the gross primary production minus the total respiration of all of the organisms living within that ecosystem. So that only difference is not looking at just single group of organisms in a smaller ecosystem or a small area, for example. It's looking at an entire ecosystem and all the living organisms in it. And in NEP, so this is something, of course, it's estimated, and it's useful because it's going to look at the net flux or movement of carbon dioxide and oxygen within the ecosystem. Because these are two molecules that are being cycled due to photosynthesis. And the release of oxygen by a system is an indication that it is also storing carbon dioxide. Generally, we've been talking about terrestrial ecosystems, but we also can look at primary production in aquatic ecosystems. So in marine and freshwater ecosystem, the things that limit primary production are light and nutrients. And of course, this applies also to terrestrial ecosystems. But with aquatic ecosystems, we have to look at the depth of penetration that light can get down through as a huge limit to primary production. And what we find is that primary production is pretty much limited to what's called the photic zone of an ocean or a lake. In terms of nutrients, we also have certain elements like nitrogen and phosphorus that are going to limit how much primary production can occur. And a smaller amount, iron, is also a limiting nutrient. So what we find out because of this, these nutrient limitations, we find certain areas of oceans in particular to have much higher primary production than other portions. And it has to do with currents. So when we have an upwelling of water, which means water is being cycling from the bottom of the ocean up to that photic region, what it carries with it from the bottom are nutrient-rich waters. And that will then make that particular region, wherever that current upwelling is, have very high primary production. So places where that can occur more easily, of course, is where water is shallow. So we see high primary productivity in shallow waters, such as where there are coral reefs or algal beds. And the definition down there of a limiting nutrient, just as a reminder, is an element that has to be added for production to increase in an area. So things like nitrogen, phosphorus, and iron. This is a picture showing the different zones in an aquatic ecosystem. So you can see that photic zone is about 200 meters there, and that's where you're going to see your primary producers. So the phytoplankton are the major primary producers in an aquatic ecosystem. We also have underwater plants in very shallow areas, but primarily phytoplankton are responsible for that primary level, trophic level of most aquatic ecosystems. So for terrestrial ecosystems, things that limit production are temperature and moisture. So you can see here, as water increases here with mean annual precipitation, we have a huge increase in net primary production, so that NPP. And of course, we know why that is when we think about photosynthesis, since water is such an important part of the light reactions. We need the splitting of water to occur for photosynthesis to begin in the light reactions. So of course water is going to have a huge limiting impact on how much primary production can occur. In terms of nutrients, we have similar types of limitations with terrestrial ecosystems. So soil nutrients can limit primary production, like nitrogen and phosphorus again. And there are different adaptations that plants actually have undertaken, and that allow them to access those limiting nutrients more efficiently from the soil. So one of the major types of adaptations that we see is the mutualistic relationship between nitrogen-fixing bacteria and plants. So these nitrogen-fixing bacteria are found along the roots of plants in order to enable them to get better access to that limiting amount of nitrogen in the soil. They also form mutualisms with different types of fungi. These types of fungi can supply plants with phosphorus and other limiting nutrients. Plants also have root hairs, so many plants can increase the surface area that they're able to absorb these limiting nutrients by increasing that surface area through many root hairs coming off of their roots. And then final adaptation that we see here is the release of enzymes that allow the availability of limiting nutrients to increase in a certain area around the plant.